mentioned, I've traveled to now over 50 countries over the past 7 years studying happiness, which is great. And one of the things I realized very quickly was that everyone had a different definition of happiness. That what they thought would create happiness, the triggers for happiness, seem to be different based upon different cultures, different individuals, even at the same organization. So if you can't define it, maybe you can't study it. And if you can't study it, then we can't have things like positive psychology. They're looking at how do we raise levels of happiness for other people. Part of what we found is that even though everyone in this room and everyone watching has different definitions of happiness, that if I ask you on a scale of 1 to 10 how happy you felt over the past 2 weeks, most of us can kind of put ourselves on that spectrum. We can put ourselves somewhere on that range. What we found is that even though that's a subjective experience, if I go into a hospital and with a broken arm, there's no pain meter they can hook me up to that automatically means that I'm experiencing an 8 out of 10 on a pain scale. The same thing is true with happiness, that we treat people based upon the pain that they actually experience, and we can actually study people based upon their subjective experience of happiness that they're experiencing in the world. But part of what I'm hoping to do, and part of the reason I wanted to come to talk with you, is that what I'd love for us to do is to help the world redefine what happiness actually means. Because I think that there's a lot of confusion about what happiness actually is. And if we do come up with a definition that's aspirational, maybe we can start a movement not only within our schools and in our families, but in our companies worldwide. There's a lot of articles that are coming out right now talking about how having a happy life and having a meaningful life, that a meaningful life is so much better than having a happy life. In terms of the levels of happiness, levels of health that you experience in the long run. I think those studies, while well-meaning, are actually leading us astray, because I think it's impossible for us to sustain happiness without meaning. And as soon as we start to try to define happiness in our life without having meaning, all we're talking about is pleasure. And pleasure is very short term, right? We could put chocolate bars in front of each of you, and then we'd be done in terms of our happiness. Some of you are like, wait, was that an option this morning? I didn't even know if that would be an option. But part of
it's Google, it's always an option.
Exactly. You've got pleasure at your fingertips, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you automatically have happiness at your fingertips. Because happiness, the way that we are hoping to start to redefine this for the world is to not have happiness be pleasure, because that's very short term. And we get addicted to it. We were talking about that this morning. If happiness is just a pleasure, it becomes a trap. Right? So that if I'm not feeling pleasure right now, well, then I must not be happy. Then I'm not going to keep working at this, or I'm not going to keep trying because this is too difficult now. What I'm interested in is how do we redefine happiness to be what I stole this definition from the ancient Greeks. How do we get happiness to become the joy that we feel striving for our potential? And I love this definition. I was at the divinity school before getting into studying positive psychology, and I was studying Christian and Buddhist ethics, because I was interested in how does the beliefs you have about the world change the actions you decide to do within that world. And one of the things that I loved about this definition when I saw it is it changes the way that we pursue happiness. Because if happiness is just pleasure, we have to keep running after it very quickly, and we know it's not going to last. But if happiness is joy, joy is something we can feel in the ups and downs of our life. It's something we can experience even when things are not pleasurable. When you're working on a very difficult project, when you're going for a difficult run, or when you're biking in to work and it's a really long bike ride. Whatever it is that you're experiencing, even childbirth, right, is not a pleasurable experience all the time. But you can actually feel joy in the midst of that. What I want people to do is to recognize and to actually seek out that joy, which I know is one of your pet projects as well, is how do you seek joy, but joy that's connected to growth. Because if happiness is actually disconnected from growth, it turns out we stagnate and our happiness goes away pretty quickly. I love playing video games, and I love them. And they're very high levels of pleasure, and I'm okay at them. But in terms of long-term meaning, there's not too much for me in my life. Now, for some people, there's a lot of meaning in video games, but for me, not so much. So if I keep doing it, even though I'm having pleasure, that pleasure actually dissipates after a while, because I'm not actually pursuing any of my potential except within that one domain. The thing I love about joy that we experience striving towards our potential is that potential could be anything. It could be as an entrepreneur, as a business leader. It could be as a lover, as a son, as a daughter, as a human being. And the more that we actually strive towards that potential, that's where people experience that greater levels of happiness, and allows us to stop making that disjunct between happiness and success. Because I was out in Indonesia, and I was speaking out at one of the factories there, and one of the managers came up to me and said, this talk on happiness might work at places like Google, or might work in places in America, but seriously, actually, our problem in our country is not that people are unhappy at work. Our problem is sometimes that people are way too happy, because they come into work. I had this guy come into work 3 hours late today, and he was like, I tried to yell at him, and he was like, what are you doing? Let's just relax and just enjoy ourselves. And I was like, that guy didn't make me happy at all. But what he's talking about there is not happiness, right? That's short-term pleasure. The guy decided to stay home that morning and didn't do the work that he was supposed to be doing. But if that's what it is, then long-term, his levels of happiness are actually going to decrease. He's never going to get to see what his potential was within that organization. He might not get to see what his potential was in terms of applying his self-control and his behavior to his tasks. So what we want people to do is to recognize that that's more on the side, it can be more on the side of apathy, right? I think the opposite of happiness is not unhappiness. The opposite of happiness is apathy, which is the loss of joy that we feel within our lives. Because if you think about it, unhappiness can sometimes make us break up with people we shouldn't be dating, or unhappiness can cause us to move to do different jobs, or it can cause us to want to get better grades in school. Unhappiness can be very helpful. What I think becomes the problem is when we've lost that joy in our life, when we lose that joy striving towards our potential. So I think that there's a revolution inside of this. If we can help people realize that happiness is joy that we feel on the way to our potential, some amazing things start to change.
Fascinating. It's especially fascinating in the context of one of your teachings from your previous book, which I thought was groundbreaking. And when I first read it, I was really impressed, which is in your previous book, which is the Happiness Advantage. You talk about the relationship between happiness and success, and you put it on the head, on its head, right? The reverse of what everybody else was thinking.
Yeah.
Which is everybody was thinking that if you're successful, you'll be happy, which is basically the premise of Asian parenting. Last me, I know. But what you say, and I agree with you, is the reverse. Is that happiness brings about success. So can you talk more about that?
Sure. So you guys might have heard the Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother book that came out about tiger parenting, which is the style of parenting you're describing, which is I'm going to push you so hard right now, and you're going to hate me for it. But when you're successful, when you're off at Harvard, you're at Stanford, when you've got a good job, then you're going to be happier.
Right.
And it turns out that formula, which undergirds like our managing styles that most companies are, our learning styles, our personal development styles, it's scientifically broken and backwards for two reasons. The first reason is that every time your brain has a success, and you've experienced it, everyone in this room experiences, every time your brain has a success, your brain just changes the goalpost of what success looks like for you almost immediately. You got good grades in school, don't get excited yet, because now you need to get into better schools. You got into a better school, don't get excited there, because then you have to get a job. You don't even have a job yet, right? So you have to get that internship and job. You hit your sales target, we raised your sales target, right? You had double growth earnings last year, that's phenomenal. That means we can double the growth again this year. And that's not the problem. We want to see what your brain is capable of. We want growth to improve, we want to see sales improve, all of these different types of things. The problem is where happiness comes in that formula. Because if happiness comes after success, which is a moving target, the brain never gets there for very long, right? But if you flip around, if we can raise your success rates your entire life, we can raise your income. We don't actually do this. We watch people whose success rates rise. That'd be very hard for us to do. We watch people whose success rates rise dramatically and their happiness levels flatline. They actually don't move. So as your success rises in your life, your happiness levels will actually remain about the same. But flip around the formula. If you can get people to deepen the social connection they feel, the meaning embedded in their relationships, the breadth and depth of their relationships, if you change and raise their levels of optimism, if you get people to see stress as a challenge instead of as a threat, when our brain is positive first, every single educational outcome and business outcome we can test for rises dramatically, and our success rates rise. So raise success rates, happiness flatlines, but raise levels of happiness within inside organizations and schools, and their success rates rise dramatically, which is phenomenal. Because when I had the opportunity I spent 12 years at Harvard, first as an undergraduate, and then I was at Divinity School, and then I was a teaching fellow there. And while I was there, like when I first got into Harvard, I applied on a dare, right? So I didn't expect to get in. We didn't have any money for college, so, but I got a Navy ROTC scholarship, which allowed me to go there through MIT. And so I found myself in classrooms full of people who were incredibly smart and, were just amazing. And I remember that I could have felt bad about myself, like the mistake. But I remember just sitting there thinking, this is amazing to get to have opportunity like this morning to get to spend time with all these incredibly brilliant and motivated people. And you could look around, and for many of you, I know some of you from Harvard actually, that you could look around and you could see the students who saw their education as a privilege, right? That they saw what they were doing as an opportunity, and they invested in completely different ways. They take classes that they get a bad grade in, like an A-, just because they wanted to learn, or they get involved with a
Obviously
sports
not
team.
Asian. That's like an Asian C.
Exactly. I like that.
I'm just kidding.
No, yeah.
Almost.
That we'd have people that would ride the bench on a sport for 3 years just so they can make friends. And those are the people who love their time there. And actually, one of our studies, we found that those are the people who give the most in alumni donations back to the school later on, which is why Harvard got interested in happiness in the first place. But afterwards, I got the opportunity to live and to stay at Harvard. I knew that if I left, that they wouldn't let me back in. And so I stayed there for the next 8 years. And I lived in the dorms with the freshmen as a proctor there. And Harvard invited me to do that. I didn't just stay in the dorm. I wasn't that guy who just stays in the freshman dorms meeting people, but for most of it. So what it meant was I could watch these students transition to high school to college. And what I saw very quickly was no matter how happy they were getting into that school, 2 weeks later, many of them, their brains were not focused on the privilege of being there, nor even fully focused on their philosophy or physics. Their brains were scattered, thinking about the competition, the workload, the stresses, the hassles, and complaints. And very quickly, what was promised to create great happiness wasn't. 80% of Harvard students, according to the Crimson poll that they had, 80% of them report experiencing depression at some time during their 4 years there. In a study that came out in 2003 by the University Health Services, they measured 2,000 of the 6,000 undergraduates and found that 10% of them had contemplated suicide at some point during their time there, which was extraordinarily high. And I know that these are statistics, but those are human beings. And it was heartbreaking watching some of these students and some of the people that we know lose that connection to meaning meaning in their life and the potential that they had. One of the studies that I got to do early on was I looked at 1,600 Harvard students to find out who rises to the top. If you have people that are extremely intelligent, extremely successful, ambitious, who rises to the top in terms of their happiness and success? And I looked at everything. I looked at what grades they got in school. I looked at their familial income. We looked at SAT scores before getting into school. We looked at number of friends on Facebook. We looked at a number of romantic partners that they'd had, which, by the way, at Harvard is they've dated less than one person on average for their entire 4 years of college.
They must be engineering.
Possibly. It was lower than any school we saw so far. It was actually 0.5 sexual partners per Harvard student.
Engineering.
Yeah. Which I only mention because I don't even know what that statistic means, right? 0.5. We were always taught to round up.
This is better than MIT.
Possibly. Probably.